reason we're here today is the kindness and generosity of a guy who is very near and dear to our hearts. He's made a lot of things possible for us down in Auburn. Now he's making something possible for you. And we'd like to show him our appreciation with a certificate. His name is Jim Wolfe. If you could come forward. Now, it occurs to me when we have a gathering like this that most everybody knows all about the Mises Institute. But then, occasionally I'm told that someone was drugged here against their will. And I noticed there was a lot of families when we were going through the name tags this morning, putting them in order. So that's possible today. So just a little bit about the Mises Institute. It was founded August 24th, 1982. That means we just celebrated 27 years. And it's all due to the efforts of Lew Rockwell. Started the Institute with his typewriter and his checkbook. And it's come a long way since then. We are a research and educational center of classical liberalism, libertarian political theory, and of course the Austrian School of Economics. We are the world's leader in providing these educational materials and conferences and media, and it's now blossomed into a worldwide movement, students, professors, professionals, people, all walks of life, and now you are part of that movement starting today. So it's time for our first speaker, who received his PhD in economics from the University of California, Berkeley. That's a little deceiving. So, yeah, dig yourself out of that hole. There's a BA from the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. He's the editor of 2 books, and he is currently associate professor in the Division of Applied Social Sciences at the University of Missouri. Now, he has a forthcoming book coming out that the Mises Institute is going to publish. We don't have a title for it yet, but, so but anybody has a pithy title they want to suggest, go ahead during the course of the day. But his specialty is entrepreneurship and business organizations. But today he's speaking on Keynesian economics, the beast that won't die. Please help me welcome Dr. Peter Klein.
Thank you, Doug. It's great to be back on the West Coast. As Doug mentioned, I did my graduate work at Berkeley. Like Seattle, a hotbed of libertarian and Austrian sentiment. One of my professors that I was fairly close to is now President Obama's chief economic advisor, Christina Romer. A very nice person, but someone whose views are a little different from mine. I remember when I started the program, I noticed that virtually everyone else in the economics department was some kind of a left, liberal, socialist, quasi-socialist, social democrat type. And I said, well, I've heard all this about diversity. Are there any libertarians or conservatives or people who might have different views than the dominant view in the department? And I was told, yeah, well, we have a conservative. And it turned out what they meant was there was a guy from mainland China who thought that Deng Xiaoping's reforms had gone way too far and that they should go back to the pure communism of Chairman Mao. So I guess there was some diversity at Berkeley. Now, I want to talk about Keynes today, and I have to confess that this is, in a sense, a depressing time to be an economist. It's a very difficult time to be an economist. Now, don't get me wrong, I love my job. I love teaching. and researching and studying about the free market, about the capitalist economic system, about the entrepreneur, about liberty, about human flourishing. But the last year and a half to 2 years, this has not been a good time to be sort of a sound economist. Think about all the things that have gone on in our economy. You have the bank and industry bailouts. This is something that nearly every competent economist opposes. Okay, I mean, saving a particular industry with government protection or taxpayer funds is, a classic example of what the textbooks call the fallacy of composition, right? The idea that something that benefits one particular group or element in society necessarily benefits the entire group. I use exactly this kind of an example when I'm teaching some of these fallacies in my freshman level courses. Bailing out the Chrysler Corporation in 1980, bailing out the airline and insurance industries after 9/11, and so on. There's a great chapter in Henry Hazlitt's wonderful Economics in One Lesson called Saving the X Industry, as an example of Hazlitt's fallacy of the broken window. Saving the X industry simply transfers resources to the X industry from the Y and Z industries and from the taxpayer, and substitutes the political process for the market process in determining how resources are allocated among activities. And yet, when the bailouts began, first the financial sector bailouts, and then the automobile industry and other industries and so on, the wisdom of economic doctrine was almost entirely ignored. The general level of discourse on the housing crisis, the bank bailouts, the industry bailouts was not just among laypersons, but among the media and among politicians and even people who should know. It was just shockingly vapid, vacuous, even by the usual standards of American political discourse, right? Listening to government officials and pundits and experts and so on talk about the financial crisis, sort of like listening to my son's second grade class discussing the nuances of postmodern French literature. Well, it's obvious the housing crisis was caused by deregulation, too much deregulation. The free market has failed yet again. Thank goodness we have the government to step in and take care of things. Then you had the bailouts of individual borrowers, right, through the Obama administration's abominable housing plan. Think about it. We're in a major recession triggered by a collapse in the housing market, itself the result not only of monetary policy, but also of specific government actions, often through Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, to make sure that the wrong loans got to the wrong people so they could buy the wrong houses. Okay? So the administration's remedy is not to let Fannie and Freddie die, their long overdue and merciful death, but to prop them up, to give them additional powers, and to subsidize private mortgage lenders, to extend yet more credit to more people who can't pay it back so they can buy even more property that they can't afford, and to make what might have been a temporary crisis into a semi-permanent one. So this was depressing as well. Now, most depressing of all is the subject of my talk this morning, the resurrection of John Maynard Keynes and Keynesian economics, particularly in the form of the Obama administration's $800 billion plus stimulus package, the so-called stimulus package. David Leonhardt wrote in the New York Times, this was a couple weeks ago, August 19th, the indispensable economist of the moment is clearly John Maynard Keynes. Keynes's prescription for financial crises, aggressive government action, and by definition, big budget deficits, has been Washington's basic approach since the collapse of Lehman Brothers in September 2008. Leonhardt is clearly right. Keynes is back in the spotlight, at least in the public eye and among most of the intelligentsia. The Keynesian, this is the great Keynesian moment, the great resurrection of a theory, an approach to the economy that to most professional economists had long since been dead and buried. If there are any of you economic students in the crowd, most of us were taught that the Keynesian approach, which became dominant after World War II through the 1960s, was sort of beaten back by first the monetarist and then the so-called rational expectations or new classical counter-revolutions in the late 1970s and 1980s. But it has come back. Keynesian economics has returned with a vengeance. Now, to the Austrian economists, the Keynesian doctrine was in its original form and remains even in its fancy dressed up form today, nothing more than a tissue of fallacies, a resurrection of long discredited underconsumptionist fallacies that no serious economist before 1936 gave any thought to. Indeed, at the beginning of the 1930s, as you probably know, as the global depression was then sort of in its early stages, the leading explanation among economists and other intellectuals for what was going on was the Mises-Hayek approach to the business cycle. The idea that there had been an unsustainable credit boom in the 1920s that had predictably burst, exposing or revealing a pattern of malinvestments that had to be liquidated for economic recovery to take place. But that Austrian understanding of the business cycle was swept aside during the Keynesian avalanche in the late 1930s. Keynes published his great book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest, and Money, in 1936. And Keynes told us, no, Mises and Hayek have it completely wrong. The problem is insufficient aggregate demand, which is a fancy way of saying spending. There's not enough total spending in the economy. And this problem is easily solved, according to Keynes, with cheap money and massive government expenditures and budget deficits. Okay? And best of all, it really didn't even matter what the government spent the money on, as long as the government spent money on something. Because this new spending would have a marvelous, sort of miraculous ripple effect, pulling the private economy back on its feet. As you can imagine, politicians loved it. Keynes's younger disciples mathematized it, and mainstream macroeconomics was born. Now, the Keynesian approach became dominant, especially when it was sort of popularized in the leading textbooks, Paul Samuelson's textbook, for example. The sort of Keynesian idea that the economy was a giant machine that could be fine-tuned by pulling appropriate policy levers with great precision by sort of enlightened bureaucrats and politicians and so on. Always in the interest, of course, of ensuring full employment and sustained economic growth and stable markets and so on. That idea was so deeply ingrained among most of the profession that sort of in the late in 1959, a New Zealand engineer named Bill Phillips built an actual machine with tubes and pipes and levers and pulleys, mainly operated by water, to sort of simulate the economy and predict and forecast the economy. It's what people sometimes refer to hydraulic Keynesianism. I mean, literally, the idea that you could build a hydraulic machine that would replicate the economy and would give the experts all the tools they needed to engage in their fine-tuning. Now, things, as I mentioned, did get better in the 70s and 80s. Hayek, of course, won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1974, and people began to inquire more seriously about the older Mises and Hayek approach, the pre-Keynesian Mises and Hayek approach to the cycle. And there were these other movements within mainstream economics that sort of shunted Keynes aside, and they were improvements over traditional Keynesianism, I think. And to many of us, these new advances were sort of, driving the final nail in the Keynesian coffin. The Austrians had shown the essential fallacy of the Keynesian doctrine, and finally, or so we thought in the 1980s, even mainstream economists have realized that Keynesian economics is hopelessly garbled. It's sort of an incoherent mess without any logical consistency. Doesn't have any application to the economy of the real world. Now, like one of those movie vampires or zombies that keeps coming back, you stab it, you kill it, And the hero or heroine turns around, and then you see in the background the zombie rises up again, with its weapon in hand. This monster has come back to life. Is economy in the doldrums? No problem. All it needs is stimulus. It needs some stimulus. Turn on the printing presses. Flood the bond markets with T-bills. Spend, spend, spend. The free market won't do it, of course. It won't spend enough because, as Keynes told us, private investors are plagued by animal spirits. They're motivated by irrationality. Only the enlightened politicians and bureaucrats can make rational spending decisions. Now, if you're worried that this extra spending and money creation might lead to some problems down the road, some inflation perhaps, no problem. Listen to San Francisco Fed President Janet Yellen, another Berkeley economist, by the way, who recently said, quote, "I'll be the first to say that it is always difficult to get monetary policy just right." It's a nice concession. But the Fed's analytical prowess is top-notch, and our forecasting record is second to none. Some of you have probably seen that little YouTube clip with all the different Bernanke remarks, up through the beginning of the housing crisis about how healthy the housing market was and how there was no danger of any kind of economic problems associated with the housing market. Janet Yellen continues, "With respect to our toolkit," that's the levers and so on, right? "We certainly have the means to unwind the stimulus when the time is right." Okay? Don't worry about these things. We put the money in. We'll take it out when the time is right. We have everything under control. Robert Blumen wrote an entry on the Mises blog where he quoted this. He titled his blog entry, "We are awesome." Okay? That's the view of most government policymakers when it comes to the economy. We are awesome. Okay. So, we keep killing this Keynesian beast time and time again, and it keeps coming back. So what's going on? Well, to understand why Keynesian economics won't stay dead, we have to detour just briefly into the history and sociology of science, social science in particular, and realize that science doesn't work, the way many of us were taught in high school. Formulation of hypotheses, testing them against the data, searching for truth using the scientific method, quote unquote, leading to these kind of incremental advances in knowledge with the old falsehoods tossed aside, new truths embraced and incorporated, and so on. That's not the way scientific discovery actually works. It doesn't work like that at all. It's much more complicated and it's much more messy. Errors, once refuted, don't necessarily disappear from the scene. They hang around. Truth doesn't always win out in the battle of ideas, at least not in the short run. There are a lot of reasons why. There are institutional reasons. It has to do with, finance of scientific research, financing of scientific research, incentives of researchers, personalities, and so on. It's a complicated problem. But we should always be on guard against what Murray Rothbard, in his History of Economic Thought project, called the Whig theory of intellectual history. Wrote Rothbard, on analogy with the Whig theory of history, coined in mid-19th century England, which maintained that things are always getting and therefore just get better and better. The Whig historian of science, seemingly on firmer grounds than the regular Whig historian, implicitly or explicitly asserts that later is always better in any particular scientific discipline. The Whig historian really maintains that for any period of historical time, whatever was right, or at least better than whatever was earlier. The result is an infuriating Panglossian optimism. In this view, according to Rothbard, there can be no such thing as gross systematic error that deeply flawed or even invalidated an entire school of economic thought, much less sent the world of economics permanently astray. But yet that is in fact what we find. That the Austrian school, for example, which thrived from the 1870s until about the 1920s, faded from the scene and was replaced by something much, much worse, the Keynesian approach to the macroeconomy, so-called macroeconomy, and then later the sort of contemporary neoclassical approach to microeconomics. Any trained historian of science will tell you that this naive Whig approach is hopelessly inappropriate. Thomas Kuhn's famous book on the structure of scientific revolutions, introducing the idea of a paradigm. And a paradigm shift shows that scientists are not sort of completely disinterested observers of the world around them, but rather are guided, in some sense blinded, if you like, by particular preconceived notions about what is or isn't the right way to do science, the right questions to ask, and so on. So knowledge can be lost. The great Austrian truths of the business cycle were largely lost after 1936. Theories such as Keynes, discredited theories such as Keynes's, can hang around, waiting for just the right moment to return. What exactly is Keynesian economics anyway? I mean, you hear a lot of people talk about it. We talk about it in a critical way, and its proponents, praise it and so on. Well, I mean, I think you can understand Keynesian economics. You can break it down in just a few simple elements. First, a very high level of aggregation, a focus on aggregate concepts such as total spending, total income, the unemployment level, and so on. Second, the absence of any role for sort of resource allocation within these aggregates. There's no role for relative prices or the decisions of individual consumers, individual entrepreneurs, individual investors. These are all ignored. And third, no theory of capital. The Mises-Hayek approach to the business cycle was built on a particular notion of the capital structure of an economy, developed by Menger and von Bawerk and their great Austrian predecessors. And that's completely absent from the Keynesian model. In the Keynesian story, fluctuations in total spending in the economy, aggregate demand, cause fluctuations in total output, aggregate output. Forget about capital and relative prices and so on. Now, supposedly mainstream macroeconomics has moved beyond this very primitive, crude level of aggregation. But you'd never know it from the discussions of the last year and a half to 2 years. People kept saying banks aren't lending enough. Businesses and consumers can't get loans. Firms have too many bad assets on their books. The key questions, though, are which ones, right? Which banks aren't lending to which consumers? Which firms have made poor investments? Newsflash to the intelligentsia. A loan isn't a loan isn't a loan, okay? Some people maybe shouldn't get a loan. Hard to understand. Not every borrower should get a loan. The relevant question is which loans weren't made to which people and why. The critical issues, in other words, revolve around the composition of lending. Critical issues in the housing crisis, the composition of lending, not the total amount. Now, Keynesian economics ignores all of this, right? It holds that only aggregates like total lending and total spending and so on matter. Government spending magically transforms into economic wealth, often at a more than 1-for-1 ratio, the famous multipliers of Keynesian economics. And government spending, in that sense, it's kind of free. It's a freebie, right? The government spends $1 and it boosts the economy by more than $1. Wow. Of course, the deficits don't matter because, as the distinguished Keynesian macroeconomist Franklin Delano Roosevelt put it, we only owe it to ourselves. Okay. What's the Keynesian critique of all? What's the Austrian critique of all this? The Austrian critique of Keynes. Well, the Austrian approach begins with the idea that resources are heterogeneous, that investments are not the same, that businesses are not the same, that consumers are not the same, that there's a great amount of variety or heterogeneity within an economy. And the critical question is to get resources allocated in the right patterns, to get financial resources and other resources to the right entrepreneurs, to get entrepreneurs serving the particular consumers who desire those entrepreneurs' products, and so on. Now, the sort of sophomoric or even childish Keynesianism of people like Paul Krugman and Bradford DeLong and so on, or like Ben Bernanke, Timothy Geithner, etc., doesn't understand any of this, but only understands aggregate concepts like national output, total employment, the price level. Okay, when was the last time the price level affected, your behavior when you went out to go shop in the marketplace. No, you're concerned about the prices of the things that you buy, not some mythical statistical aggregate. When government policy generates an artificial boom in a particular market, such as housing, it draws resources away from other parts of the economy. And if those investments are caused by some artificial government stimulus, monetary policy, housing policy, and so on, the key to recovery is to let those resources flow out of that market and back to the other sectors or segments of the economy where it belongs. It's quite simple in terms of the housing market. House prices should be falling. Okay, it's good that home prices are falling. Interest rates should be rising. Savings rates should be going up. Debt levels should be going down. The current administration's policies, like that of its predecessor administration, are designed to do exactly the opposite. To keep the housing market from shrinking, to keep any prices from falling, to keep any firms from failing, to keep any consumers from reducing their consumption. Okay? A child thinks only about what he sees right in front of him. Okay? He can't see the things that don't exist because of his actions. He doesn't see the things outside his immediate range of vision that are harmed by his decisions. And that's the way many Keynesian commentators think. That's the mentality that they have. One good example is the so-called shovel-ready criterion for the allocation of stimulus spending. There's an interesting piece from an engineering professor at the University of Minnesota named David Levinson. He pointed out, he said, well, in the 1930s, when you were literally building with shovels, maybe this kind of a thing made some sense. This professor says that was largely unskilled labor. Today it's blue-collar labor, but not unskilled. The guy brushing the asphalt back and forth is unskilled, but the guy operating the steamroller isn't. And there's an assumption out there that construction workers are interchangeable between residential and highway projects. But a carpenter isn't a whole lot of help in building a road. Okay? Modern Keynesian economics, which retains its master's belief in homogeneous labor and capital, and is focused on macroeconomic aggregates, treats a worker as a worker as a worker. Okay? Lending and spending, that's all that matters. It doesn't matter what is being lent to whom. It doesn't matter what is being spent on what. You simply need to lend and spend, and that brings so-called idle resources into use. As Hayek famously put it, John Stuart Mill's profound insight that demand for commodities is not demand for labor. That's Hayek's way of saying, quoting Mill, that the total spending in the economy by consumers does not necessarily translate into a particular pattern of employment in resource markets, because consumer preferences are transmitted only indirectly and in a complicated way to particular labor markets. So boosting spending in total may not reduce unemployment in any particular industries. This insight, demand for commodities is not demand for labor, according to Hayek, which was said in 1878 by Leslie Stephen as the one doctrine whose complete apprehension is perhaps the best test of a sound economist, remained for Keynes an incomprehensible absurdity. Okay, so this criterion, this level of understanding that according to Hayek is the sound test, is the one test of any competent economist, remained for Keynes an incomprehensible absurdity. Keynes just didn't get it. Okay? Why can't we kill this beast? Why can't we kill it? If it's wrong, if it's easily refuted, why does it keep coming back again and again? One insight comes from a 2008 book by John Wood called The History of Macroeconomic Policy in the United States. Wood notes that in the U.S., fiscal and monetary policy has been more or less the same over a long period, regardless of what academic economists are saying about monetary and fiscal policy. Policy, in other words, is largely uninfluenced by theory. In fact, Wood suggests the direction of influence between theory and practice is largely from practice to theory. In other words, scholars are coming up with theories to justify the policies that already exist. And of course, that's the classic explanation for the spread of the Keynesian doctrine in the 1930s, that rather than proposing some sort of new theory of macroeconomic policy, it simply provided intellectual cover rationalization or justification for the massive deficit spending and easy money policies that were already in place. Okay? The University of Chicago economist Luigi Zingales put it nicely in a recent article. He said, Keynesianism has conquered the hearts and minds of politicians and ordinary people alike because it provides a theoretical justification for irresponsible behavior. Medical science has established that 1 or 2 glasses of wine per day are good for your long-term health, but no doctor would recommend a recovering alcoholic to follow this prescription. Unfortunately, Keynesian economists do exactly this. They tell politicians who are addicted to spending our money that government expenditures are good. They tell consumers who are affected by severe spending problems that consuming is good and saving is bad. He says, in medicine, such behavior would get you expelled from the medical profession. In economics, it gets you a job in Washington. By the way, the sort of Keynesian delusion doesn't just affect policymakers. It affects professional economists as well. And, I've long suspected, I can't prove this, so caveat for those of you who are watching on the internet, this is just a conjecture on my part. I suspect that people like Paul Krugman, for example, and Brad DeLong, I suspect that for them the appeal of the Keynesian doctrine is ultimately based not really on scientific grounds, but on some kind of aesthetic grounds. They just like it, okay? Deep down in their hearts, they aren't really comfortable with private property, free markets, individual choice. They don't think ordinary people are capable of making wise decisions. They think that they and people like them, the elites, should be in charge, should be running the system. They resent the fact that most people don't want their lives controlled by Berkeley intellectuals or Seattle intellectuals, right? They resent the fact that all these technical arguments about the effectiveness of monetary and fiscal policy, the relationship between aggregate demand and output, and what really went on in the 1920s and 1930s and so on. I think to a lot of Keynesian economists, these discussions are really beside the point. It doesn't really matter. I think for people like Krugman and DeLong, the belief that markets are naturally unstable in the absence of government planning is an article of faith. It's a deeply held personal belief that no amount of argument or evidence or statistical analysis will resolve, will challenge. I should mention, by the way, some of my free market and Austrian colleagues think that the Austrian approach hasn't won out in the marketplace of ideas because our arguments aren't good enough, because we aren't persuasive enough. Our historical and empirical work isn't sophisticated enough, and so on. But I strongly reject this view. Not that, of course, our arguments can't be better, not that our work can't be more sophisticated, that our evidence can't be stronger. Of course, we can always do better in making our arguments, in doing our analysis. But the truth is, in an interventionist economy, there will always be a strong demand for interventionist economists, interventionist theories, rationalizations of interventionist policies, and so on, because they provide intellectual and moral cover for interventionism. It's as simple as that. Government officials and their supporters want to increase the size and power of the state. The enabling class of what you might call court intellectuals wants its piece of the action too. To groups like this, so the allure of the Keynesian elixir, if you like, is just overwhelmingly strong. No amount of theory or evidence will persuade them otherwise. Now, of course, I'm generalizing. There are always exceptions. I'm not claiming that every economist or policymaker who subscribes to Keynesian economics is sort of corrupt in this fashion. But I think there is a lot of truth in this. Now, one silver lining in sort of the late unpleasantness is that there has been a rebirth of interest in the Austrian critique of Keynes. Even mainstream journalists, some mainstream economists, even government economists at places like the IMF, the World Bank, the European Commission, are going back and rereading Mises and Hayek and saying, since Keynes is sort of now the dominant explanation for things. Maybe we ought to go back and look at some of the alternatives to Keynes. What were some of the critiques of Keynes? Did Keynes really answer them? Did Keynesian economics really address these critiques? And people are realizing that the Keynesians didn't. Okay, so there's some resurgence of interest in the Austrian tradition, which of course is a wonderful thing. Among the educated layperson, books like Tom Wood's Meltdown, and of course Ron Paul's books, the Ron Paul movement, Ron Paul's book on the Fed, and so on. The phenomenal success of these publications is a testament to how intriguing the Austrian critique of the Keynesian model really is. Can we kill this beast once and for all? Is there a silver bullet or a dagger through the heart that will finally bring it into the grave? I don't know. But we have to try. We have to keep fighting it. We have to try to kill the beast, even if we don't succeed. Remember the words of Virgil that were adopted by Mises as his personal motto: do not give in to evil, but proceed ever more boldly against it. Well, now is the time for that kind of boldness. Thank you.